Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I'm starting my coverage of Agatha Christie's short story collections with the Poirot Investigates compilation. My approach to short stories is a little different than it is to full length novels. In a short story, I don't mind a lot of frivolity and a little quirkiness. They are obviously much shorter in length than a novel, so things like characterization are less important because there simply isn't a lot of room for it. So, my main factors in assessing a short story is how enjoyable it is and how well the plot functions. And Christie's short stories really do vary depending on the collection, so it's just a case by case basis for me. For the Poirot Investigates series, there are 11 stories to talk about, and I think this is a very strong collection overall. I remember the first time I read these stories, and I just wasn't impressed by them, but I was younger then, and I didn't really have an interest in short stories. But now I really enjoy this collection. Even my bottom ranked one I think is quite enjoyable and pretty decent. Fair warning, there will be spoilers ahead, including the solutions to these stories. So let's get started. At number 11, the weakest short story in the Poirot Investigates collection, in my opinion, is The Kidnapped Prime Minister. And I actually think the story is pretty well written and plotted, but it's just the kind of story I don't prefer. As the title suggests, the British Prime Minister is kidnapped after a failed assassination attempt. He was on his way to a secret peace conference during World War One, and this is obviously a very high stakes situation, and Poirot is called in because he's the best detective in the world. And in general, I think this plot is very thriller-esque. It reminds me a lot of the spy plot from The Clocks, which I didn't like, though I do think this is better. The solution is a bit incredible, where Poirot realizes the assistant kidnapped the prime minister and his driver, and they were living in this cottage in the countryside. It all works, but it's not particularly clever or convincing for me. And that, coupled with it just being a plot I wasn't too engaged in to begin with, means the kidnapped prime minister falls into last place here at number 11. At number 10 is a short story that I think is clever, but doesn't really work for me, and that is The Adventure of the Italian Nobleman. I had a lot of fun reading this story, and there's a lot of delightful passages about this lavish feast our victim, Count Foschettini, was having, allegedly with two other people. And I think the setup to this is clever. The Count's attendant Graves was seen leaving the Count's flat when his employer was having dinner with these two other men. The Count phoned his doctor, who is with Poirot, and rushes over. The Count is found murdered, and he is alone. The dinner has been eaten except for one side dish and the dessert, and I think in theory the solution here is clever. In reality, there were no other dinner guests. Graves killed the Count, then ate three plates of dinner to make it look like there were three people present. He then left the flat to phone the doctor, which provided him with an alibi. And Poirot is onto him because he left the uneaten food behind, and while I think the plot is clever, I just find it very difficult to believe once you start actually thinking of it that someone would have committed murder in this way. It would have been just so much easier for him to not eat all of the food, and even if he did, just dispose of what remained. I give Christie some points for creativity and the jovialness of this one, but this story falls short here at number 10. At number 9 is a short story that I think is largely fine, but I wasn't wowed by anything, and that is The Disappearance of Mr. Davenheim. And like I said, this story is pretty baseline. Mr. Davenheim is a banker who disappears, and the contents of his safe have been stolen. From pretty early in the story, I was largely onto what happened. I didn't really consider any other possibilities. Mr. Davenheim was embezzling and faked the break in to start a new life somewhere else and escape justice. I do think there is a good clue here where Poirot learns that all the items in the safe are easily transportable, meaning Mr. Davenheim could have simply taken them with him. But what puts the story above the previous two is that I enjoy the banter between Poirot and Jap, where Jap has money invested in Davenheim's bank and Poirot tells him to withdraw it. And this is part of a bet they make, and I found that a lot of fun to read. So it's for that specific reason that places the disappearance of Mr. Davenheim above the other two here at number 9. At number 8 is another short story that I think is pretty clever, but I just wasn't as hooked into as the others, and that is The Tragedy at Marston Manor. And I considered putting this one lower on the list. I feel like it lacks quite a bit of substance. It's one of these murders that are made to look like suicide, allegedly for the purpose of insurance money. Mr. Maltravers is the victim who allegedly killed himself to leave his wife a large insurance claim. I really feel as if there's nothing to this story. thought it was pretty obvious that Mrs. Maltravers killed her husband. This is a Poirot short story, so it's not going to be obvious, but there really just isn't any other possibility. The reason why I have the tragedy at Marsden Manor this high is because I do think the murder plot itself is clever. Mrs. Maltravers heard about this story about a man who committed suicide and asked her husband how to demonstrate how he may have done this. And when he does so, she just pulls the trigger while the gun is in his mouth and kills him. I think the solution as to who isn't interesting, but the how is. So I have it here at number 8. At number 7 is a story I think the solution was pretty much foretold from the start, but I enjoyed reading it anyway, and that is The Adventure of the Egyptian Tomb. And I love stories centered around ancient Egypt and the associated archaeology and curses and whatnot, but this is an Agatha Christie, so you know there's a human at work here, and I do think the solution is fairly obvious, but I enjoyed the story a lot nonetheless. Poirot pretends to believe in the curse, and he and Hastings travel to Egypt to investigate. The story has a lot of deaths for a short story, which is unusual, but Chrissy does set up the appropriate atmosphere, which is something I think she tends to ignore in some of her other short stories, where she has limited space to accomplish this. Our main victim is Sir John Willard, an archaeologist who died shortly after opening an ancient tomb. Several other people involved in the expedition have died recently as well. I think there are some very clever aspects in this one. Obviously, there is no curse, and Sir Willard died naturally, but the other deaths are quite interesting, where one of the characters has led another into believing the curse is real, so he commits suicide. Naturally, the crux of the matter is money. We have a bunch of greedy heirs here, and while I think the outcome was fairly obvious, I do think this is a clever little short story, and I enjoyed reading it, so I placed it here at number 7. At number 6 is a short story with a thin plot, but one I find very enjoyable, and that is The Case of the Missing Will. Poirot's client in this story is Violet Marsh, an educated young woman who hires her to find her uncle's will. She has 1 year to find the will, otherwise, she will be disinherited. And despite the thin mystery here, I think Christie pulls off some very good character work. Violet Marsh is from this class of newly educated women, while her uncle Andrew didn't believe that women should be educated. So he left her this quest to test her brains and her wits. The solution is a little cheesy. The actual will was written in invisible ink, which now appears to be a dirty envelope with a key attached to it. And this is really the only clue because the rest of Marsh's things are clean and neatly organized. There's not really much to talk about here. My favorite thing about this story and why it's this high is that Poirot is fantastic in it. I love the ending where he declares that Violet Marsh is a genius woman because she had enough sense to hire him for the case. And I just think this is peak Poirot. I love this moment so much, so it brings the case of the missing will up here to number 6. At number 5 is one of two jewel theft stories in this collection, and that is The Jewel Robbery at the Grand Metropolitan. This one deals with the theft of a pearl necklace belonging to the appropriate named Mrs. Opalson. The main suspects are Celestine, Mrs. Opalson's maid, and an unnamed hotel chambermaid. The necklace went missing during a time when only those two women were in the Opalsons' hotel room, but were never really apart except for a few minutes, and if only seconds when Celestine left the room. And for me, I'm not sure if the plot mechanics actually worked that well with this one, but I do have it this high because I think the plot is more clever than those of other stories I've already talked about. The hotel maid stole the box in the seconds when Celestine was out of the room and then passed it on to a valet who then handed the box back to the maid who replaced it on a second occasion when Celestine left the room. And I think much of this plot relies on circumstances outside of their control, so I'm not a big fan of that. But I do love these impossible crime stories. Much of the intrigue comes from wondering how this theft was pulled off rather than the excitement from what it actually turned out to be. But I wasn't at all disappointed with the solution either. It's not a letdown, so I have the jewel robbery at the Grand Metropolitan here at number 5. At number 4 is a story that I do think has a like medium-sized flaw to it, but I enjoy it, and that is the $1 million bond robbery. And like I said earlier, my outlook on short stories is that there are short little ditties to be enjoyed. It's not that I don't care about the mechanics or the plotting, but they're just a little less important to me in a short story, and I think this one exemplifies that. The story centers around Philip Ridgway, who is accused of stealing the titular bonds as he was traveling with them across the Atlantic. The bonds are stolen, and Ridgway claims that his case they were in was picked. And this is another impossible crime story because the situation is set up in such a way that only Ridgway could have stolen the bonds. And I'm a big fan of these kinds of stories, and the solution is satisfying without being ridiculous. The bonds were never with Ridgway or on the ship, and I found this to be very clever. But my issue with it is that Poirot learns the real bonds were on a different, faster ship, which is how they were able to be sold before Ridgway landed in America. And this is never at all indicated in the story. I guess one could suppose there was a faster ship, but we were explicitly told the ship Ridgway was on is the fastest, or at least one of the fastest. But it's small discrepancies like this that keep the $1 million bond robbery out of the very top. But in a short story, it's not really that major of a knock for me, so it comes in here at number 4. At number 3 is the other jewel theft story, The Adventure of the Western Star. And I found this one to be very clever as well. I think this is a great example of a mystery short story that does not contain a murder. I don't think you need a murder in a mystery story necessarily, but it does make it very hard to pull off a good one. And Christie does this splendidly here. Poirot is approached by a Mary Marvell, who informs him a Chinese man has threatened her and her jewel, which came from the left eye of an idol, and she needs to return it from where it came. Mary's friend Lady Yardley has the right eye of the idol, and she too is being threatened. And Mary's jewel is stolen at a house party that Poirot attends. I found the build up to the theft to be very good and very intriguing, and I like Poirot's actions. The solution is fantastic. It's one of the best tricks in a Christie short story. There never were two jewels, only the one that Mary had. Her husband essentially stole the jewel from Lady Yardley, whom he had a past fling with, and he regifted it to his current wife, but he had to steal it back from her because he replaced Lady Yardley's with a fake, and it was going to be sold, and he needed to cover for that. I found this to be a fantastic solution and a very enjoyable story overall. The reason why this one is not higher on the list is because there is a lot of unpleasant yellow peril nonsense going on. But other than that, The Adventure of the Western Star is a very good story, and it lands in here at number 3. At number 2, we have a locked room mystery, and that is The Mystery of Hunter's Lodge. And this one is a murder mystery and is pretty fleshed out for a short story. Poirot was hired by a Mr. Havering, whose uncle Harrington Pace was shot to death in a locked room. Mrs. Havering and the housekeeper witnessed the uncle and a bearded man enter a room together, but then they heard a shot and the other man disappeared with one of the pistols and the uncle was dead. And Poirot seems to have figured this out immediately, and one of the best parts of this for me is that Poirot is essentially bedridden with the flu, so he has to rely on Hastings and Japp to provide him with information, which is always fun because those two, either never get anything right or they have the wrong outlook on things and they push the wrong information in Poirot. And the solution to this is pretty good, where Poirot deduces there is no housekeeper, that she was Mrs. Havering the whole time, and the couple conspired to kill the uncle, claim his estate, and then trick Poirot into believing them. They actually do get away with it, only for them to die randomly in a plane crash, which was actually a pretty common occurrence in mystery stories back then. And that just goes to show how the whimsicalness of the stories plays out. So I have The Mystery of Hunter's Lodge here at number 2. And now for the top spot. And I will admit, I don't think this is the best quality story in the collection. And if this were a full length novel, it absolutely would not be number one. But I, by far and away, just have so much fun reading this story compared to the others in the collection. And that is The Adventure of the Cheap Flat. And this one makes me laugh so hard every time I read it. I just love this conspiracy over a posh London flat that is so cheap to rent that everyone flocks to it, and then when someone goes to actually rent it, they're told it's already been let. And this keeps happening over and over and over again until a couple named Robinson manages to snag it. But Poirot and Hastings learn they've been living there for months when they claim to have only just moved in. And I find this mystery just so whimsical and enjoyable. Is it the best quality story? No, absolutely not. But I love it. It's a very high stakes one as well because there's sort of like this mafia type subplot involved in the solution, but I find this mystery of a cheap flat being just so funny given how expensive houses housing is today. The story is a lot of fun, and I think the trick involving the Robinsons is also good, where the people involved are looking for someone named Robinson to come by because that's the alias they've been going by. I mean, it is all a little far-fetched, but like I said, I don't take necessary issue with that in a short story. The Adventure of the Cheap Flat is my favorite story of this collection by far, and it comes in at number one. And that's it for this video. Make sure you like and subscribe to the channel to keep up to date. And I've noticed a large uptick in views lately, so I just want to thank everyone for that. And if you are new to the channel, make sure you check out my past videos for more content about Agatha Christie and other mystery authors such as Ellery Queen and Niall Marsh, and there'll be more coming in the future. Next week, I'm covering another short story collection by Agatha Christie, and this time it's the Partners in Crime collections featuring Tommy and Tuppence, who I always love, even though I know they're not necessarily the most popular of Christie's sleuths. But stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.